I also wasn't initially intending to talk about this because it didn't happen, but on April 22nd, on Easter Monday in Poland, Bishop Rafał Markowski, the chair of the Council for Religious Dialogue within the Polish Episcopate and the chair of Committee for Dialogue with Judaism, was forced to react to the incidents mentioned in Pruchnik on Good Friday, the so-called Judgment of Judas. And this is the image from that incident. Ostensibly, it was a reenactment of Judgment of Judas on Good Friday, but it became very clear that there are contemporary connotations when the 30 lashes that the effigy got from the children were complemented by additional 5 lashes advocated by adults, quote, because they wanted the reparations from Poland, a reference to the bill, Justice for Uncompensated Survivors Today Act that passed last year. After the local newspaper reported about the Pruchnik's Judas judgment, and the story gained traction, it elicited condemnation from the World Jewish Congress, and then on Easter Monday, Bishop Markowski issued a statement. In the context of the events that took place in Pruchnik on April 19th, the Church clearly expresses her disapproval of practices that violate human dignity. The Catholic Church will never tolerate manifestations of contempt, pogarda in Polish, towards members of any nation, including the Jewish people. At this Easter season, we recall the truth of faith that Christ gave his life for the salvation of all, from which results Christian attitude of respect toward every human being. Comments left by readers online demonstrate that both the events in Pruchnik and the response of the Polish Bishops' Council elicited a strong backlash. But the Pruchnik incident illustrates the dilemma that the Catholic Church has faced when confronting anti-Semitism. The Church has been trapped between a need for moral response, condemning despicable acts, and public sentiments condoning these very acts. All this sometimes also encumbered by local politics. But the Church's complex responses to anti-Jewish prejudice also illustrate the existence of multiplicity of voices within the Church itself. The Church is constituted of many agents. It wants to present itself as the Church, but it has many agents with different views and attitudes present even among its leaders. These different voices, some righteous and prophetic, as Adam Michnik has put it, and some more pragmatic, have always competed with one another. They are still audible among the leaders of the Catholic Church, both in Poland and within the Church more broadly. Both the Church in Rome and the Church in Poland worked slowly to recognize and address the question of anti-Semitism. In 1938, Pope Pius XI informally expressed discomfort with anti-Semitism, calling it a movement incompatible, inadmissible, and alien in which Christians can have no part, while allowing the faithful, quote, all the right to defend themselves, to adopt measures of protection against what threatens their legitimate interest. And he distinguished between racial anti-Semitism, which was not compatible with theologically motivated hope for Jewish conversion, and what some called at the time the so-called Jewish question, anti-Jewish sentiments grounded ostensibly in economic, political, and social matters. A thin line for sure, and one loaded with ambiguity. This cautious ambiguity is what marks the Catholic Church's responses to anti-Jewish sentiments and actions. In 1946, the Kielce pogrom, in which dozens of Jews were brutally murdered over the course of many hours, elicited passionate responses from Polish intellectuals, both secular and those identifying as religious, including former and self-described anti-Semites like Konstanty Ildefons-Gałczyński and the influential pre-war politicians associated with Endecja like Stanisław Grabski. Grabski, for example, connected the protection of Jews with the protection of the good Polish name in the world. Such protection, he argued, would only be effective through healing of Polish life from hatred and the reign of our Christian morality in the whole of our lives, both in private and in public life, always and everywhere commanding love of neighbor. That voice calling for end of hatred and for renewed Christian morality was also heard from Bishop of Częstochowa, Theodor Kubina, who spoke with righteous clarity just days after the pogrom in Kielce, for after all, who could not agree that a brutal killing of dozens of innocent survivors, men, women, and infants, was not a horrendous crime. In Kielce, Bishop Kubina stated, yes, I do have that slide. In Kielce, mass slaughter was committed on Polish citizens of Jewish nationality. The moral and actual perpetrators of the slaughter have trampled on human dignity and horribly violated the Christian commandment of love for one's neighbor and universal principle, do not kill. Nothing, absolutely nothing justifies the Kielce crime, which is deserving of the wrath of God. The bishop then condemned fanaticism of those who used criminal ends, medieval ideas and beliefs that are alien both to the Christian community and to the principles of the general coexistence of all fellow citizens, without distinction of nationality and religion. Those people, he said, must be absolutely and without objections condemned as criminals according to all divine and human laws. Those who have been provoked into crimes confounded our internal coexistence in the country and defamed the good name of a Pole abroad. Indeed, he added, the Kielce crime was unquestionably condemned by all those who have, by all those who have heartbeat of neighborly love. He then appealed to human consciousness and a Christian and moral principles and condemned both the violence and the ritual murder libel, which started the pogrom and which he called lies. This was by far the boldest statement condemning both the Kielce pogrom and for the first time in centuries, the blood libel. And Kubina's statement was apparently also read in other dioceses. Still, the Bishop of Kielce and the Polish episcopate were more circumspect. On July 11, 1946, 4 days after Bishop Kubina's letter, Cardinal Augustyn Chlont, the Primate of Poland, at a press conference issued a statement condemning all murders, regardless if they targeted Poles or Jews in Kielce and in all parts of Poland. But he also added, during the extermination under the German occupation, Poles, though they themselves were targeted, supported, hid, and rescued Jews, putting their own lives in danger. Many Jews in Poland owe their lives to Poles and Polish clergy, the primate continued. Jews holding leading state positions and seeking to establish a regime the vast majority of the nation does not want in Poland can be held responsible that this great relationship is being destroyed. It is a destructive game, he added, because it leads to dangerous tensions. In fatal armed clashes on a political battlefield, unfortunately, some Jews perish, but so do immeasurably more Poles. The sentiment in Cardinal Chlont's statement showed the trap of what became anti-communist obsession that will become a major, as I mentioned earlier, obstacle to Polish-Jewish relations and later efforts of reconciliation. In 1946, the Catholic Church in Poland was in a difficult point. It was facing a hostile regime, a regime, as the primate noted, rejected by many, and one still fought in armed clashes. In fact, Bishop Czesław Kaczmarek of Kielce would be arrested in 1950 and then imprisoned and tried by communists and sentenced to 12 years in prison, which he didn't serve because of the changes that happened after 1956. But it was still a regime that in a complicated way, for better or for worse, also came out against anti-Semitic attacks. And was now seen as pro-Jewish, run by Jews, as we've seen. In this struggle, anti-Semitism became both a liability and a weapon. And so what could have been a clear condemnation of undeniably horrific violence and murder became politicized. The Bishop of Kielce, who saw firsthand what some Kielce citizens were capable of doing, may have been fearful of losing local support. He thus echoed Cardinal Hlon's sentiments, and Cardinal Hlon, for his part, sought to protect the interest of the Church. Losing faithful over a response to violence against Jews would have been precarious. But as Bishop Kubina's response shows, one could focus on just this one issue, an issue that could have been addressed with moral clarity without needing to become or appear philo-Semitic. The tendency, however, became to dilute any statement concerning Jews with other issues, such as the opposition to communism. This tension was not unique to the Church in Poland. As World War II demonstrated the human capability for utmost brutality and ruthlessness, exposing the depths of hatred, many Christian thinkers began to probe to what extent Christian theological teachings may have contributed to that ruthless anti-Semitism. These early conversations were not easy, and it took 20 years from the end of World War II until the Vatican II Declaration Nostra Aetate. Nostra Aetate was initially intended to be a decree on the Jews, but it ended up being diluted to a declaration about non-Christian religions, and with the discussion of Jews included in the last fourth paragraph. Nostra Aetate, when you read it closely, in the end says nothing about Jews. It only addressed theological teachings of deicide and the idea that God had rejected Jews. But for all its weaknesses, it has led to tremendous transformations in the Catholic-Jewish dialogue and reconciliation. And it too embodies the polyphonic aspect of the Church, including voices of those who genuinely sought to reconsider the Church's teachings and actions and inactions, and are unafraid to look honestly in the mirror, and those who were protective of the Church and unwilling to reckon with the past and tradition and seek to shield behind other topics and aspects of history. It took a long time to begin to implement Nostra Aetate. How long? It depended on a country. The French bishops, for instance, issued a statement on relations with Jews 5 years after Nostra Aetate. There's in 1972. I'm sorry, 7 years. I made the wrong thing. 7 years. Their statement was also a theological affirmation of the Vatican Declaration and said little about the more recent painful past. It was only in September 1997, in the midst of the Maurice Papon trial that was itself part of French reckoning with the Vichy past, when the Catholic bishops of France addressed World War II. But when they did, they issued a movingly sincere document. The French bishop's document was framed around questions of conscience, which no human can ignore. It noted the Catholic Church knows full well that conscience is formed in remembering, and that just as no individual can live with himself, neither can society live in peace with a repressed or untruthful memory. Reckoning with choosing pragmatism over decisive moral stances, the bishops noted that when French Jews were in internment camps and the country, quote, had been beaten, lay prostrate, and was partially occupied, the hierarchy saw the protection of its own faithful as its first priority, assuring as much as possible its own institutions. This priority was legitimate, the bishop stated, but it was also a retreat to a narrow, and I quote, a narrow vision of the church's mission at a time when many members of the church and many non-Catholics yearned for the church to speak out at a time of such spiritual confusion and to recall the message of Jesus Christ. Thus, those in authority of the church caught up in loyalism and docility remain stuck in conformity, prudence, and abstention. The church leaders in France, the bishop's statement said, failed to realize that the church, called at the moment to play a role of defender within a social body that was falling apart, did in fact have considerable power and influence, and that in the face of silence of other institutions, its voice could have echoed loudly by taking a definite stand against the irreparable. The letter is long and rich in content and contained a powerful passage which I think could serve as a model for any reconciliation, including Polish-Jewish. Here it is. We can pass no judgment, the French bishops wrote, either on the conscience of the people of that era. We are not ourselves guilty of what took place in the past, but we must be fully aware of the cost of such behavior and actions. It is our church, and we are obliged to acknowledge objectively today that ecclesiastical interest understood in an overly restrictive sense took priority over demands of conscience, and we must ask ourselves why. In Poland, the impact of Nostra Aetate and later efforts of reconciliation between Polish Jews and Catholics and between Poles and Jews was hampered by communist and anti-communist politics. Its implementation in Poland, that is of Nostra Aetate, was made impossible after 1968 and the silence that followed. But the existence of the declaration was known, and some years later, Pope John Paul II provided leadership through public gestures and substantive statements to those who wanted change for the better. But Nostra Aetate, paradoxically, also provided a shield. It focused only on theological matters, the relation of Jews with God, without touching directly on the immediate past. One could conceivably engage in a theological dialogue with Jews without having to face the painful past. Positive change is difficult and slow, despite the most sincere efforts. It is clear from the history of Nostra Aetate and Catholic-Jewish dialogue in Poland. Among the leaders of the Catholic Church in Poland, the two voices we heard in the aftermath of the Kielce pogrom continue to sound. On the one hand, there are those genuinely interested in honest reckoning with the past, and on the other hand, there are those who continue to hide behind these protective shields of Nazism, communism, anti-communism, and even theology. These voices, almost a duophonic back and forth chorus, are heard distinctly in most of the documents issued by the Catholic Church in Poland. Well, the bishops of France and Bishop Kubina stayed focused on the morality of the atrocities Jews suffered and considered what role Christian compatriots may have played. The Polish bishops tended to vacillate between sincere reckoning with the past and hiding behind those protective shields. In 1991, the pastoral letter issued by the Polish bishops, a voice resembling that of Bishop Kubina, regretted that some Catholics remained indifferent to the incomprehensive tragedy of the mass murder of Jews on the Polish soil. Or worse, that some Catholics were the cause of the death of Jews. They will forever gnaw on our conscience. They wrote, if only one Christian could have helped and did not stretch out a helping hand to a Jew during the time of danger or caused his death, we must ask for forgiveness to our Jewish brothers and sisters. This unquestionably sincere voice was then immediately countered by a voice that resembled the sentiments already expressed by by Cardinal Chlon and Bishop Kaczmarek. We are aware, the second voice interjected, that many of our compatriots still remember the injustices and injuries committed by the post-war communist authorities, in which people of Jewish origin also took part. We must acknowledge, however, that the source of the inspiration of their activity was clearly neither their origin nor religion, but the communist ideology from which the Jews themselves, in fact, suffered many injustices. The first voice then took its turn expressing regrets for all the incidents of anti-Semitism committed at any time and by anyone on Polish soil. But then the second voice returned, drawing attention to the untrue and deeply harmful concept of Polish anti-Semitism, and reminded the audience that the Poles as a nation were one of the first victims of the same criminal racist ideology of Hitler's Nazism. This back and forth weakened the impact of those most powerful passages that would have helped Poland, Polish Catholics to move forward toward a better understanding of the past and toward a meaningful dialogue on Polish-Jewish relations. These divergent voices were still heard, though to a lesser extent, within the Polish Catholic Church in the statement on the Jubilee of 2000, which powerfully calls for the purification of memory and reconciliation. It calls for the memory of the Holocaust to be preserved, and in the spirit of the Jubilee's act of penance, notes that along noble efforts by Poles to rescue many Jewish lives, there are also our sins from that period, indifference or enmity towards Jews. The letter calls to overcome all expressions of anti-Jewishness, anti-Jewish Judaism, and anti-Semitism that existed and exist among Christians. These powerful words are then somewhat muted by a short statement demanding that anti-Polonism should be fought with equal determination. The issue of anti-Polonism returns in many statements by Polish bishops, even those that sincerely seek Polish-Jewish reconciliation and dialogue. It is true, anti-Polonism exists among Jews. But one also has to be mindful that anti-Polonism is also an anti-Semitic trope developed at the end of World War I among Polish nationalists. It reframed the old trope of Jews as enemies of Christianity in a new national mold, presenting Jews as enemies of Poland. In fact, as I've learned from my student Agata Sobczak, that Jews, the Polish nationalist press noted that Jews sought to, quote, slander Poland and turn the opinion of the whole world against Poland was already deployed as an anti-Semitic argument against Jews in Polish nationalist press in 1918. To be sure, Jewish-Catholic relations have improved since World War II and since 1965. But in Poland, the delayed implementation of Nostra Aetate, the conflicted voices, and above all, the inability to confront the past in a focused and straightforward way, have resulted in mixed messages and the occasional flare-ups like this year we've seen over Easter. In the 1997 letter of the Polish bishops, of the French bishops, might offer a way forward, a way to address with sincerity and without distractions the core moral issues of the past, for as Abraham Lincoln said, we cannot escape history. But the way we understand history shapes the way we forge our future. Thank you.